Welcome back. Now, we're leading the news today with the tragic story that two 17-year-olds have died in two separate knife attacks less than 24 hours apart. Well, last year there were more than 40,000 incidents involving blades. That's more than 100 a day. The Justice Minister is Rory Stewart, and he joins us now from just outside Penrith in Cumbria. Thank you very much for being with us this morning. I just want to start on knife crime. What's happening on our streets?
Well, the first thing is a really relentless focus on bringing together a team across the police and the intelligence agencies to get to grips with what's driving this knife crime and how to make it more difficult. So that's everything from making it more difficult to actually acquire knives in the first place, getting into schools, looking at education programs, making sure that we understand the connection between knife crimes and drugs, and putting investment in. And one of the reasons why we've put hundreds of millions of pounds more into the police and into the intelligence services is precisely because of these kinds of issues.
Now, you're moving on to other issues, because we've got a lot to talk about today, of course. You've got a bit of a reputation as perhaps one of the most eloquent defenders of Theresa May's Brexit deal. It's coming back to Parliament soon, and goodness knows it does need a few defenders because it was absolutely historically defeated last time. Are you confident it's going to get through this time round?
I don't think one can ever say that one's confident in this particular world, but I think there's been a huge amount of movement. I think that people are becoming more pragmatic. They're recognising much more than they did in the past that there are a limited number of alternatives to this, and that the alternatives are worse. But I think people are also beginning to acknowledge that this, if we can deliver it, will allow us to move on. It will give business certainty. It will bring investment into the country. So it could actually be a very positive opportunity for the country, and I'm hoping on the 12th of March that colleagues not just from the Conservative side but also from the Labour side will join us in seeing that this is the chance to get this done.
You sound very optimistic there, but at the same time MPs are still absolutely bitterly split on whether or not this is an acceptable deal or not. I mean, as Prisons Minister, do you just want to lock them all up in the House of Commons until they finally get some kind of agreement?
Well, I've long felt that. I've long felt that if we could put 650 MPs in a room and lock the door, we'd get some kind of agreement. But we've moved on from that now. I think we're now in a world where we can see painfully, because we've all been through it together, you and the media, the public, voters, members of Parliament, just how difficult this negotiation has been. And I think people are beginning to recognise that this is a deal that gives us control over immigration, but it also keeps very close economic, political, diplomatic ties to Europe, which are vital for our economy, and provides a really good foundation for going forward. I mean, I think if we can land this, and we're only 9 days away from it, if we can land this, it really could be the beginning of a great opportunity for Britain. It could be a great next 5-10 years, but we're going to have to get through this.
OK, well, it's good to know that we've moved on from the idea of locking MPs up in a room together. That is good news. If Theresa May's deal does fall, MPs will be faced with a choice of a delay to Article 50 or leaving with no deal. So you're someone who I'm sure has given this a great amount of thought. What do you think should happen in that circumstance?
Well, I think that the first thing to understand is that all those other options are worse than the Prime Minister's deal. And I hope people are focusing on this, because if you think that through, extension to Article 50, which is going to be a vote which would effectively give, let's say, a couple of months' extension, would resolve nothing. It would put us in a world in which we were still in a zombie world, not knowing where we're going. And it would increase the chance of other options. It would increase the chance either of people pushing for general elections, which wouldn't solve everything, for another referendum, which I think would solve nothing at all. It would just tell us what we already know, which is that the country is divided. Or it would push people towards a customs union, which would stop us being able to trade with the rest of the world. So all these other options are worse options, which is why, apart from the fact I genuinely believe this is a positive deal, it's a deal that can really work for the economy, we need to vote for the Prime Minister's deal.
But which one would you pick? I mean, the last time this was put before Parliament, the government suffered the worst defeat of any government ever. I mean, it's not an unreasonable question to ask that if it's defeated again, which one would you choose out of no deal or an extension to Article 50?
Personally, I think we would have to be forced into an extension for Article 50, but I think people need to understand that that is a worse option than the Prime Minister's deal. It's not where we want to be. It's not where I want to be. I think these are horrible options. The reason I've been trying to passionately argue for the Prime Minister's deal from the beginning is that I think the nearly 2 years of negotiations, a lot of very, very talented people have come up with a good deal, and it would be ridiculous to reject this opportunity for these uncertain and worse futures.
Is the government planning to whip the vote on no deal?
I don't know what the answer to that is. That's a decision for the chief whip, so that would remain to be decided. I think we do know that, judging by the votes that have happened in the past, that there doesn't seem to be a parliamentary majority for no deal, but we will see what happens on the day after. But just again, to appeal to colleagues, I mean, I keep going around this again and again in a circle, but getting this deal through is the answer to all these problems. We don't want to be driven into these other things. Nobody wants a new general election. I think a referendum would be deeply divisive. I think there are no good alternative proposals on the table, so let's get behind this deal.
So could you vote for no deal then if the government were to whip that way? Or would you resign?
I've made it very, very clear from the beginning that I'm not resigning. I've promised to resign. I'm a prisons minister. I've promised to resign about prisons. I'm trying to improve prisons, and I've put my job on the line saying that if I don't manage to improve prisons, I'll resign over that. And I'm supporting the Prime Minister very strongly. I think she's done an unbelievably good job. I think we owe her a lot of respect. If we can get this vote through on the 12th, I think people should have huge admiration for her. And I'm definitely not threatening to resign.
OK, fair enough. You can only resign once, and given the state of prisons, I think the chances of resigning over prisons are not insignificant. The National Audit Office found, for example, that the probation rule reforms carried out by your predecessor, Chris Grayling, when he was the Justice Secretary, not only failed to reduce reoffending, but led to skyrocketing numbers of released offenders being returned to prison for breaching their licence. I mean, when you took on the job of Prisons Minister and looked around at the situation, did you despair?
I think we are facing very huge challenges. If you look at prisons, violence has risen steadily for 5 years, and a lot of this has been driven by new types of drugs, particularly spice. And I really believe that this can be turned around, but the way to turn this around is to get back to basics. It's about making sure that we really improve the perimeter security and that we invest in supporting and training staff. We've got nearly 4,500 more prison officers, but it's now making sure that they're trained properly and supported properly. And I can already see in places like Leeds or in ISIS prison in London the beginnings of green shoots, the beginning of the sense that we can turn this around. But it's a very, very tough job. It's a job I'm very proud to have. I'm very proud of the prison officers and the work they do, but nobody should underestimate how difficult it is, partly because violence in society is increasing. We began with knife crime. You'll hear about attacks even on ambulance workers. It is a very troubling moment, and prisons are right at the centre of that.
Now, you perhaps understand the Middle East more than most politicians after walking for thousands of miles through Afghanistan, Pakistan and Iran. So I wanted to talk to you a bit about the situation in Syria just as we end the interview. You previously said this about British jihadis fighting in Syria: "We have to be serious about the fact these people are a serious danger to us, and unfortunately the only way of dealing with them will be, in almost every case, to kill them." So I'm interested to know what your thoughts are on how we should deal with the wives of Islamic State fighters, people like Shamima Begum. How should we deal with these people?
Well, Sophie, I think the first thing to say is that nobody should underestimate how much of a threat these people potentially can be. I mean, I've spent a lot of my life working, obviously, in Iraq and Afghanistan, and people who join ISIS have a very, very distorted, very cruel, very savage view of the world. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that there should be very clear consequences for people who travel abroad. One of the issues has been that it is quite difficult gathering the right kind of evidence in the middle of a war zone, but we want to create a system where, God forbid anything like this should happen in the future, we do not end up in a world in which hundreds of British citizens think they can somehow, with impunity, travel to countries and get involved in extreme radical terrorist groups. So I'm afraid it's a very difficult decision, and obviously as a Justice Minister we have to think very seriously about our legal obligations and the way that we treat our citizens. But I think the Home Secretary was right in the case of Shamima Begum. I think it is important that we find ways of taking clear action and not suggesting that somehow this is an innocent or acceptable practice to go and fight for ISIS.
The people who are innocent, though, are the children of these fighters. What should happen to them?
Well, we have a huge obligation to children, obviously everywhere in the world. And one of the things we have been doing is, of course, investing heavily in international development aid, making sure children are properly looked after, properly fed, even in the region. We've got a lot of money going into Kurdistan, where Shamima Begum's family's been, a lot of money going into Lebanon, a lot of money going to children, British taxpayers' money, looking after children and supporting them. And of course, we do have obligations to them, but we also have obligations to the British population. We have to think about our own national security interests. These are not easy things, but I don't think there's some simple answer to this or some simple way of getting around the fact that what Shamima Begum did was wrong, and that the group she's associated with is not just a sort of joke group. I mean, this is a group that genuinely is committed to atrocities, genuinely committed to killing British people, genuinely committed to destroying functioning governments around the world. So I think we have to find a way of balancing our natural instincts of looking after people with having to protect our population against very, very dangerous groups. And I'm afraid she's found herself right in the centre of this.